It's not working? Okay, sorry. I'm very sorry that Rabbi Dweck can't be here with us tonight, but I'm having the pleasure of welcoming you on behalf of the Montefiore Endowment. For those of you who don't know us, let me tell you that the Montefiore Endowment is an independent charity governed by its own trustees. The endowment is an independent charity governed by its own trustees. It maintains friendly relations with the Spanish and Portuguese Jews congregation and works from premises that we rent from it. Among the endowment's principal aims is, in the words of our founder, the promotion of the advanced study of the Holy Law as revealed on Sinai and expounded by the revered sages of the Mishnah and Talmud. With the help of RIETS, the Institute of Advanced Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, we currently run 2 such courses. The first is to train senior rabbis from this country and from all over the world, as far away as Australia, in Dayanut, Jewish family law for the diaspora. And the second is our Smicha program, which is the training of young men to serve as rabbis and teachers in English-speaking communities. This evening's seminar by our 3 very distinguished speakers is intended to discuss interpretations of Jewish law as they relate to women. According to my wife, half the human race. And as the topic has aroused so much interest, it has been open to the public. There may be time at the end of the evening for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please write it out, including your name, and pass it to me. I'll be sitting here. Pencil and papers are available at the desk at the entrance. Now over to Rabbi Levy, who was chairing this evening's discussion.
It is very appropriate that this lecture is taking place in this hall, the Montefiore Hall, and being sponsored by the Judith Lady Montefiore College. That is the official name of our college, the Judith Lady Montefiore College. She was a lady. There's a portrait over there of her, who was deeply religious, very spiritual, and she went with her husband numerous times to visit Yerushalayim, Tzfat, and other times. And when she went there, the rabbis there realized her spirituality and wanted her to be able to express that when she was in Jerusalem. And hence she practiced a little custom that has meant a lot to Sephardi women throughout the ages and still means a lot to this congregation, when often a lady will come just before Shabbat with oil, olive oil, to light the Shabbat Ner Tamid and say a little prayer. And that she did on more than one occasion in Yerushalayim. And once when she was in Tzfat, and they were having a Hachnasat Sefer Torah, the rabbi, a distinguished rabbi, Rabbi Abraham Dov, a Hasidic rabbi, allowed her to stand next to him. He was carrying the Sefer, and she was carrying a light in honor of that Sefer. The other thing which she did, which was quite controversial at the time, was that she encouraged her husband to start a school for girls in Jerusalem in order to be able to learn Hebrew and to learn how to sew. That was in 1855. And today, in her memory, we are holding this important conference on Halacha and Jewish women. just half an hour ago, all the lecturers, together with myself and Mr. Gubbay, were upstairs having a little supper. And the atmosphere of warmth, of understanding, of respect was most important. Because as I see this, what we are doing tonight is a mahloket l'shem shamayim. There are many views which will be expressed tonight. There are many views on halachic matters, and I'm sure that there will be big differences between the lecturers tonight. But if we're able to do it l'shem shamayim, then what we are doing is a big mitzvah indeed. We are fortunate to have three distinguished scholars. Rabbanit Henkin, Chana Henkin, is an authority on Jewish law. She runs the very successful Nishmat program, which the Montefiore Endowment supports. And to show how much respect she has in Yerushalayim, this year she lit one of the lights for the Independence Day torch. And that shows the respect with which she is held, not only in Yerushalayim, but all over the world. We also have Rabbi Dr. Michael Rosensweig. Let me tell you that I had the pleasure last night, over dinner, to spend 2 hours with him. I had never met him, but I learned so much from what he said to me. He is in charge of the most important kollelim in Yeshivah University, where it has outstanding rabbinic scholars. And with his permission, I'm going to tell you something which is a little bit historical. He is sitting just in front of a very, very famous Chacham Meldola. He wrote a classic on the laws for women and mikveh, which is a classic to this day, and which Hasidim all over the world read and study. When they come here and they see the picture of that rabbi without a beard, they are somewhat shocked. And it is exactly the same with Rabbi Rosensweig. He may not have a beard, but he's a tremendous halachic knowledge we are able to admire, not only here, but all over the world. And not only that, we were in Baker Street last night, and suddenly he starts quoting from Sherlock Holmes, and giving me word for word of the book, and how he associates it with important halachic issues. So, finally, all I can say is we have here, of course, another scholar, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Sperber. I had the zechut to be taught by his father, Ibn Pakudas Chovot HaLevavot. We are the same age, so we were doing our PhD in the great room of the British Museum, which no longer exists as a library. And since then we met on many occasions in our work for interfaith relations. He is a world expert on minhag and has written numerous books on this and other subjects. And ladies and gentlemen, we are here to meet, to learn, to discuss, and to hear different views. All we need is to be able to respect each other, even if we do not agree with what the other person is saying. And we pray that we will be able, as a result of tonight, to go out with more knowledge as to how we can work together and be able to understand each other. And without further ado, I call on Rabbi Sperber, who will give an introductory talk, and that will be followed by Rabbanit Henkin, and then Rabbi Rosensweig. They will each speak for around 10 to 15 minutes, and after that, I will be asking them some questions, and if there are any questions from the audience, which you will give to Mr. Lucien Gubbay, we will try to deal with that if we have enough time. Thank you very much. I think this is less.
Yeshut Harav, Maradata, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I see many friends in the audience, people whom remind me of my earlier English days, some 50 years ago. First of all, I'd like to congratulate and to thank Rabbi Levy for organizing this very significant meeting. It's significant because it deals with issues which trouble the Jewish community throughout the world. It's significant because it deals with, I hope, some very basic questions as to the interface or perhaps clash between tradition and innovation. The world today is not the world of 50 or 100 years ago. Halacha is dynamic. It has to take into account contemporary situations. I don't want to go into any sort of complex halachic discussions. It's neither the place nor is there the time for this. But I would like to try to put before you my basic halachic crazy. I would start with a quotation which seems simple, but it's actually very complex, from one of the sponsors of Rav Kook Zatzal. He said, "It is not forbidden to permit the permitted, even though it was not practiced in the past." I'll repeat that. It's not forbidden to permit the permitted, even though it was not practiced in the past. Now, this is actually quite a revolutionary statement. There's a general notion that what happened in the past constitutes tradition, masoret. And any deviation from tradition is not really halakhically legitimate. So when we suggest new directions, and for the purposes of this evening's discussion, new directions expanding the role of women in ritual, in leadership, in areas of learning and education, it has been suggested that by doing so, we are going against Jewish tradition. there's even some sort of halachic justification for such an argument based on the sources, which would suggest that, and I use here the halachic terminology, lo ra'inu ra'aya, that which we have not seen practiced in the past is evidence that such practice is not legitimate. This is a view that we find in the Shulchan Aruch, in the beginning of Hilchot Yoredeya, and in other places in Choshen Mishpat, and it's not accepted by all the authorities, but it has been one of the arguments put forward by those who see as illegitimate various new trends in the Orthodox community for partnership, minyanim, for the ordination of Rabbinic ladies, and so on and so forth. My basic position is that that which one can demonstrate from traditional normative Jewish halachic sources to be permitted, if it is permissible, then it should be encouraged if it will benefit the community. Now, we all know that not everything that is permissible is necessarily good. We all know the famous passage in the beginning of Parshat Kedoshim by the Ramban, Aval B'Reshut HaTorah. There may be things that appear to be permissible, but they're immoral, they're damaging, they have negative effects. But if something can be shown to be permissible, legitimate, according to the sources, and it can be shown to have a positive effect, it can be shown to enhance people's spirituality, it can be a bulwark against negative trends in Judaism, then it should be encouraged. So the question really is, when we speak of these new movements, new trends, new modes of ritual activity, women participating in a variety of different manners in the synagogue in ritual activities, or taking certain leadership positions in the community. Is this a positive movement, or does it have negative aspects? It is a departure from tradition. Is it splitting the community, or is it enhancing elements of the community? And even if it's splitting the community, well, our communities have always been split. I mean, some of those splits were very positive. Hasidim and Snagdim in the late 18th and the early 19th century were at one another, but now we have wonderful communities of Lithuanians and Hasidim. So, the question is not whether we are illegitimately making breaches in tradition, but whether those breaches are doing more good or doing more bad. I would contend that the changes that are taking place in many, many communities throughout the world, and I'm in contact with quite a number of them in many different countries, in the field of expanding women's role, whether it's leadership or whether it's in the area of ritual activities in the synagogue, creating new congregations with greater spirituality, with a great deal of deep motivation. This is a positive move. In a time when there's an attrition in the Orthodox community, when intermarriage is one of the major challenges to our people in this age, everything that enhances religiosity, spirituality, and remains within the framework of normative halacha should be encouraged. There are those who are our detractors. There are those who have come out with statements not very substantial in their halachic argumentation, but trying to clamp our activities, trying to minimize our importance. I personally see this as a great compliment, because we've been noticed, because we're on the scene, because when people say that we're neo-reform, it means that they're threatened. And they're threatened by something which they realize has a real halachic basis. So the argument is really an argument as to values. Are we doing more good than damage? Is there really any damage? I think we're doing a tremendous amount of good. But I can also appreciate those people who feel threatened by us and who use the normal buzzword of the slippery slope. Because when you start redefining your borders, you have to be very careful that you don't go too far, that you actually have a point at which you stop. And the borders move as your perspective moves, as you learn more and become more aware of the options that the halacha actually gives you. So undoubtedly there is a danger, and we must be aware of it. And those people who oppose the sort of suggestions that I and others have put forward, I have deep respect for them. I would just ask them to bolster their critique with real substantial halachic argumentation. Thank you.
Rabbanit Henkin.
Rabbi Levy, honored Rabbanim, friends who have gathered here together. I arrived from Jerusalem this afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you. I congratulate Rabbi Levy and the Montefiore Endowment, Mr. Gubbay, on undertaking this symposium and putting critical questions before the community, because I agree with Mrs. Gubbay that this is 50% of the Jewish people, and we have to concern ourselves with that. As observant Jews, halacha regulates every aspect of our lives. We're living in the 21st century. We're grounded in halacha, and that the interfacing of our lives with the world around us is regulated by halacha, and that presents us with dilemmas, with questions about our past. Everyone knows that in the 20th century, women are involved in every field of academic and professional endeavor. Women in Israel, we had a woman head of state. There are many today. But until recently, women were not part of the halachic discourse. We have codes of law. We have 1,000 years of responsa literature, that's case law. And women appeared in the cases, but women were not part of the discussion. There's a passage in the Talmud in Sukkah which I love. It discusses whether an elephant can be the wall of a sukkah. In order to have a kosher sukkah, you need 2 and something walls. And let's just say you're traveling somewhere in the world and you don't have wood for the wall, or what fabric or whatever you would use for the wall and pin down, but you do have an elephant. Can that elephant serve as the wall of a sukkah? You're probably interested in the answer, and the answer is yes, he can if he's tied down, so long as he's tied down. Because even if he dies, he's still going to be the requisite 10 tefachim. Why do I tell you this story? Because within the halachic literature, there's discussion of women as halachic authorities, as postcode halacha. You had this in the 12th, 13th centuries in Tosfot, who were discussing the role of Dvorah, the prophetess, who's described as V'hishoftat Yisrael. She judged Israel at that time. And since a woman cannot be a judge halakhically, so what exactly did she do? And the Rishonim, the early medieval halakhic authorities, discussed that. Tosfot says she taught them the laws. In the 16th century, the preeminent Egyptian sage, the Rabbaz, Rabbi David ben Zimra, said the same thing in slightly different language, that she was engaged in teaching them the laws. Now the pasuk says, "Vayalu eleha b'nei Yisrael lamishpat." The people of Israel came up to her for judgment. The people of Israel doesn't mean she was a 3rd grade teacher, which is a wonderful occupation, but that's not what Dvorah was engaged in doing. And the great 18th century Jerusalem sage, the Birkei Yosef, the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, you will notice he is Sephardic, explained that what Tosfot is saying, she taught them the laws, means that she was a halachic authority, she was a poseket halakha. You have the same position articulated by Sefer HaChinuch in pre-expulsion Spain. The interesting thing about this is that, on the one hand, this is not a position which is in any way the subject of contention. There's no disagreement. A woman can be a halachic authority. But to speak about a woman as a halachic authority, until we got to our time, was like speaking about an elephant as the side of a sukkah. In other words, it's a theoretical situation. The Talmud is not looking for us to use an elephant as the side of a sukkah. The Talmud is asking the most theoretical, the most extreme question in order to clarify the law. To talk about a woman, halachist, until we get to our time, is like talking about an elephant that's the side of the sukkah. One can imagine it as a theoretical situation, but it never existed. What has changed in our times is that over the last 25 years, institutions of Torah learning for women have flourished, primarily in Israel, but not just. And as a result, we are seeing today, I don't want to exaggerate the phenomenon, but we are seeing today a first generation of Talmudically literate women. And as a result, questions which were theoretical in the past are suddenly becoming actual questions. And as they become actual questions, the discussion that didn't exist in the past is suddenly provoked. My colleagues educate rabbis. I was listening at suppers, the discussion of where their students are. And I was sitting and thinking to myself, as I was hearing about Rabbi Sperber's rabbis in communities, and Rabbi Rosensweig's rabbis in communities, Talmidei Chachamim, I was thinking, I'm graduating women. I'm educating women. In 1997, we started out on a path without knowing the title we were going to give to this path. But we said, or perhaps I should say, I said, because it was such, there's a crying need within Jewish life. I'm seeing people suffer. It is not a mitzvah to permit people to suffer. And I think the solution can come from learned women. And it was that time that we started educating Yoatzot Halacha. The name came along later, but the intent was to educate women, both with a higher halachic education in the field of Hilchot Nida and women's health, and together with supplementary medical studies, which were extremely important to the results. 2 years later, in 1999, we graduated our first class. Today, we have 100 serving Yoatzot Halacha. We have 16 more graduating this summer. I'm very proud to say that here in this room is Yoatzot Halacha Lauren Levy, who is sitting right here, if there's anyone who doesn't know Lauren. From that time, a cadre of women has been produced who are profoundly dedicated to strengthening observance of Jewish law. That's what this is about. It's about strengthening observance, and it's about Darkei Noam. It's about making people's lives pleasant. Elsewhere in the same Masechet, Sukkah, there's a discussion of which tzemach, which plant can serve as anaf eitz avot, as the one of the 4 species, which we use the myrtle branch. And the Gemara asks, perhaps oleander can serve. Oleander is that beautiful, beautiful plant that grows all over Israel that has pink flowers or white flowers. Wherever you have water, you have oleander. The fragrance is marvelous. There's just one problem with it, that it's poisonous, primarily to animals. A human being will not die from it. A small animal should not be eating it. A big animal, it won't do good things for his stomach, and it won't do good things for the human stomach. So what does the Gemara say? Oleander cannot possibly qualify to be one of the 4 minim. Why? Because the ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness. I regard that as a mandate. The Torah could not have chosen something which is harmful to, even to animals, because it is not Darkei Noam, if there is an alternative. Now, all of us know there are situations which are problematic, which don't have a solution. But if there is a solution, I believe it is incumbent upon us to bring that solution to Jewish life. And that's what Yoatzot Halacha are about. They sit and they study Hilchot Nida, from the Gemara to the Achronim, the same curriculum plus that is studied in that field of Jewish law for slicha, for rabbinic ordination, together with the curriculum in women's health. The studies are incredibly intensive. A physician in the first class commented to me that her medical boards were a piece of cake by comparison to her bechinot, her examinations at the end of our program. We intentionally chose a non-confrontational name, and I'm going to discuss that in a little while. But what are they doing today? The answer is we have received more than 300,000 questions which have been recorded via our hotline, our telephone hotline, our websites which function in several languages. The Yoatzot are paid in order to staff them, and Yoatzot in communities who have recorded their questions. These are questions on hold that would not have reached rabbis. In the United States, we have Yoatzot Halacha who've been placed in around 30 synagogues. I think actually today the number is larger than that. More than one synagogue employing the same yoetzet. There are 30 yoetzot in the United States. We have 16 more, by the way, who are graduating our program in Israel and also a satellite program in the United States this summer. In any event, rabbis in communities where yoetzot work have said, before the yoetzet came, I told her, listen, do not be disappointed. I received 3 questions. I received 18 questions last year. And then when we find the yoetzet gets 300 questions. And then a year later, it's 600 questions. These are questions that would not have been asked. What would, on the whole, what would have happened? So the answer is, some women would observe too stringently. Some women would observe too leniently. Neither is what they should be doing. And people would be suffering. So this is not, I would not even say that the fuel behind me was getting up and doing something in order to equalize the status of women. That's not what this is about. This is about answering a need, a religious need in Jewish life, and enabling women as well to realize their talents, to delve into Torah, to serve the community. There's a term which is used, and which probably will be used tonight, so I'm going to be introducing it now. Psikat halacha, the decision-making in halacha. And people ask me all the time, they postcode, and why did you choose the term yoatzot halacha, which means halachic advisors? And I answered, there's a Gemara in Sota, which quotes a pasuk in Mishlei. The pasuk in Mishlei is speaking about the wayward woman of Mishlei. The pasuk is Rabim chalalim hipila va'atzumim kol harugeha. She has felled many, and enormous are the numbers of her fallen. So the Gemara in Sota takes the pasuk out of context, and the Gemara says, Rabim chalalim hipila, zeh talmid chacham shelo higia lahora'ah umoreh. That is a talmid chacham, a halachic scholar who has not reached the level of ruling, and he rules. That is, he has felled many. Atzumim kol harugeha, and huge are the numbers of her fallen. That's a Talmud, zeh talmid chacham shehigia lahora'ah ve'eino moreh. That's talmid chacham who has reached the level of halachic stature, and he doesn't rule. There's a problem in both cases. The problem in the first case is devastating. If you have someone who should not be paskening, who should not be issuing a halachic ruling, and they issue a halachic ruling, the results can be catastrophic. They can make life miserable. They can cause someone to violate halacha. On the other hand, if you have someone who's a resource, who should be ruling, and they're not ruling, that's catastrophic. And if you compare Rabbim and Atzumim is even greater than Rabbim. Atzumim kol harugeha. The waste of a resource that could strengthen Jewish life. In my opinion, regarding women, we're on a journey right now. I think when you get close to the world of halacha, the most important thing is humility. Knowing your stature, knowing when you should speak up and knowing when you shouldn't speak up. Halachic ruling does not mean answering a question. If someone says to me, my dairy spoon fell into my meaty pot, is it non-kosher? If I observed kashrut, I'm going to be able to answer that question. I'm going to say, well, was there anything in that meaty pot, or was it empty? I'm going to ask several questions, and on the whole, I would say most kashrut observers could answer that question. That's not called paskening. Paskening, ledamot psika, ledamot milta lemilta, means to extrapolate from a situation and to apply to a new situation. On the whole, that is not what yoatzot halacha do. I believe we're on a journey, and I believe that journey is for the benefit of Jewish life, a journey towards atzumim kol harugeha. But you need to be humble about where you are holding, and to know what question demands consultation with a higher authority and what question does not demand consultation with a higher authority. And I would say, because I've watched this firsthand for decades, who will call up, what young rabbi will call up my husband to ask a question. A young rabbi as well is not going to go out there and answer questions immediately that are beyond his level. I want to say further, to speak for a moment about the synagogue, and I've spoken for quite a while, so I'll say a few words about the synagogue and then I will sit down. I have to tell you a story. I was in a city in the United States which will remain unnamed, and the rabbi said to me, "We've just done renovations in the synagogue. We have a marvelous mechitza. I must show it to you." So I went with the rabbi to see his mechitza in his synagogue. What did I see? They carved out at the top of the mechitza, it was mahogany, it was beautiful. They carved out Eshet Chayil. So I'm standing with Rabbi in the men's section, and he's showing me the mechitza, and I said to him, "Rabbi, do you realize the letters backwards?" You can see the letters from the men's section. You can't read them from the women's section, unless you have a mirror. You know, for me, that's a metaphor. I think that this rabbi had not davened, had not prayed in the women's section very often and didn't have the experience. I don't think I think the women's section of the synagogue must be made user-friendly, and I'll tell you what it is that concerns me most. There are small things and very big things. The small things are, if you have a synagogue that has religious articles on the wall, a calendar that tells you whether you should be saying Mashiv Haruach or not, if you have Modim de Rabbanan on the wall, it's also going to be in the men's section. You have any religious symbol in the women's section? No. If there's any lady who's sitting in the room who is contemplating a gift to her synagogue, why don't you tell them that this isn't halachically controversial? Beautify the women's section with uplifting things. When I go to shul, during the reading of the Torah, I listen to the Torah, but between when the aliyot are being called up, that's when I sit and I learn. How many times do you have a women's section that has a Gemara there? I found it in one shul so far, and it's just because the minyan was in the Beit Midrash. But the bigger thing is there's no address in the women's section. Is there any one woman other than myself who has wanted a Misha Beirach recited for someone who's ill? And there you are, you're in the women's section. How do you get that Misha Beirach made? Who do you go over to? Now, you may or may not be married. If you're not married, this is yet more of a problem. But even if you are married, you may be married to someone who's forgetful. How do you get that Misha Beirach stated? Why can't there be a woman? There's got to be a woman on the employ of synagogues. Let it be a volunteer position. You have a Gubbay, have a Gubbay. That doesn't mean they need to do the same thing. This is not halachic. This is common sense. This is saying the synagogue has got to catch up to where we are. What I would like to see in the women's section of the synagogue is I would like to see every community recalibrating its budget to make room for women. I would like to see the Jewish community as a whole recalibrating its budget to make room for higher learning of women. The role I see in the synagogue for a woman is a woman scholar who is giving shiurim and talking about things which are not controversial but are rarely done, are new but are not halachically controversial, but they are not done on the whole. I want to see that woman being someone who's energizing the women's section of the synagogue and who's an address. If you have a woman who wishes to say Kaddish, She has someone comfortable that she can approach and she could say, I'm going to say Kaddish, so that she doesn't have to stand there and be faced by the agony of the moment. Do I call out? Do I not call out? What do I do? What's my place? I want to Misha Berach. Let there be someone I can go to. Ideally, I wish that woman to be Yoetzet Halacha as well. But she needn't. She could be a woman scholar who is not a Yoetzet Halacha, but someone who will bring energy to the women's section in the shul during prayers and bring vitality to the community not during prayers. Final statement. My philosophy is religion, the importance of religion in women's lives must be understood, even if we are dealing with mitzvot which are not obligatory on a woman. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein spoke about, wrote about, who is the person who has, he took a position against the revered Shagat Aryeh on the question of whether you can carry a shofar on Yom Tov, to blow for a woman. And the Shagat Aryeh says the woman is not obligated to hear shofar, so it's not a need. Rabbi Feinstein said, how can you say something which is not obligatory on a woman, but a mitzvah which she could take upon herself? How can you say that's not a need? How can we dismiss women's religious needs? Everything, principle 2, everything needs to be done within the framework of Halacha. Principle 3 for me, I don't agree with ordination of women. Stay away from fractious titles. Let things happen on the basis of need. The position, the result is going to be healthier and more faithful to Jewish life. In general, I go back to what Rabbi Sperber said. Halacha has a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue between, Rabbi Sperber said, tradition and innovation. I call it curators and innovators. The curator is the one who seeks to preserve. There's a Gemara in Chagiga that speaks about two sages. One sage said he would not make any statement that was not made to him by his rabbi. And the other sage said, there's no such thing as Beit Midrash without innovation. My friends, I think those who succeed in innovating are the innovators who establish a dialogue with the curators, who understand the concerns of the curators, who don't dismiss the concerns of the curators, who build a bridge between the two. My husband likes to say there's halacha, there's mitziyut, there's hora'ah. Halacha, Jewish law, actual life, and then there's halachic ruling. And he says halachic ruling, hora'ah, is the bridge that you build between halacha and mitziyut. Not everything that you can do should you do. We need to assess very, very carefully. It's a judgment call, how you preserve the fabric of Jewish life. Are you strengthening or weakening observance? This is where Rabbi Sperber and I disagree. We'll probably discuss this later on in the program about partnership minyanim. Halacha is not open-ended. We don't have a House of Lords or a House of Commons or a Senate or a Knesset who votes on what halacha should be. Halacha has its rules. Factors can be introduced into halacha, and that is the importance of having women as halachic thinkers. We cannot make halacha into what we want. We can bring what we want into a discourse with halacha, and that is in the hands of the halachic scholars, and I am delighted that today we are seeing women move into that area. Lahagdil Torah u'lahadira. Thank you.
Very much. Firstly, I want to thank Hosin Bechor Aksanya. I'd like to thank Rabbi Levy and his staff for arranging and for coordinating my trip, my visit. I want to thank him for the kind words that he said before. After rethink the whole, I guess, clean-shaven thing, but I appreciate it very much. I've enjoyed becoming more acquainted with the rich history of this community, thanks to him and its legacy. And I welcome my fellow participants, Rabbi Henkin, Rabbi Sperber. It was a pleasure to meet with them earlier, have supper with them. The issue of Halacha's perspective on gender roles and its application regarding some of the particular hot-button issues, some of which we'll very briefly explore this evening, I think requires a broader framework. It requires some context. In my opinion, the confusion that arises, people's perception of what the problems are, or really what problems are not, is very much a function of the fact that, for many reasons, often this first step is skipped. People begin with an immediate discussion of the controversial issues, the ones that are picked up on the internet, if you will, and like all serious subjects in any field, and Torah is the most important field. As committed Jews, this is our Kihem Chayenu V'Orech Yameinu. This is what we live for. We live to implement the divine will, to understand it, to redefine our persona on the basis of its rulings and its values, as we'll discuss very briefly. And therefore, the necessity of dealing with issues in a more rigorous and serious way, and therefore understanding the background, is critical. Of course, unfortunately, the nature of this kind of a panel discussion, the structure of the event severely limits the necessary capacity to properly explore the framework or the details, but at least potter below klum mi'efshar, at least a little bit of an effort or an attempt to provide some background, as the other speakers did. So what I'd like to do is just be a little abstract in the beginning, and then try to establish some criteria or guidelines, and then in the next part of the session, I will very happily weigh in or comment on the more specific controversial issues, but hopefully in light of the brief presentation of the principles. The central components that are endemic to innovation, cultural interaction, which needs to be balanced by the integrity of halachic performance and commitment, the preservation, curate, or whatever word is used, they're all fine and good. These components need to be defined. The first point is the inimitable role of halakha, of Jewish law, even relative to other cultures that value law. Many other cultures and religions, every culture, every society requires law. If not, ishas kavero, chayim b'la'o. If you want to avoid internecine conflict, if you want to just set up any kind of elemental, stable system, law is required. And of course, there are other religions, and they have a perspective towards law. But the Jewish perspective towards halakha, towards Jewish law, is singular. Bereshis bara Elokim, we can start at the very beginning. Literally, the first word of the Torah is Bereshis, in the beginning. And Chazal tell us, everybody's familiar with the first Rashi, Bishvil HaTorah Shenikra Reshis. The world was created so that the Torah could be implemented, that this magnificent gift from the Ribbono Shel Olam, this divine, or the divine imprimatur of this system of law, could really give meaning, give structure to man. Yom HaShishi, pasuk also from the very beginning of Bereshis, and of course prominent in our ritual. Chazal tell us, the Hei HaYediyah, the sixth day. Which the sixth day? The day of the 6th of Sivan, the holiday that we just recently commemorated, Shavuos, the giving of the Torah, because our rabbis teach us that had Klal Yisrael, had the Jewish people not embraced enthusiastically the acceptance of the commitment to Jewish law, then literally the world would have unraveled. It would have reverted into chaos, which is the midrashic way of saying that, again, what gives life consequence and purpose, pick it up, it's better. What gives life consequence and purpose is being divinely directed and guided. Maimonides, the Rambam, calls this the achdut hamaskil v'hamuskal. After all, the great philosophical question of all time is how and what makes life meaningful? And how can we enter into a relationship with the divine being? We're all puny human beings, limited in our capacity, we're mortal, we're puny, selfish, limited in so many ways. What gives life its meaning? What allows us to develop a relationship with the omnipotent and omniscient HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the answer is the achdut hamaskil v'hamuskal, the union of the subject matter and its author. It's the Torah itself. Torah is Dvar Hashem, it's the Word of God, and as such, it provides a mechanism. When we study it, we attach ourselves to the divine being. It's almost a miraculous concept. It's a concept which is incoherent, but it's the foundation for meaning and direction in life itself. And consequently, a major feature of Jewish law, of Halacha, is its immutability. The Rambam, in his codification of the 13 Ikarei Amunah, that many of us say every morning, the Ani Mamins, as they're sometimes called, has 2 of the 13 that relate to this principle of immutability. The fact that the law is given, it's a divine law, and therefore it is a permanent law. Yet, confronting novel situations and pressures, economic, social, cultural opportunities, innovations, that is something that any living, dynamic, I think Rabbi Sperber used the expression dynamic, I agree with it, system needs to be able to confront. Innovation, circumstances of innovation, initiatives, new circumstances are endemic to life and to all legal systems, and there are different attitudes. It's fascinating to study, it's not for now. Even in secular thinking, Aristotle and Plato, Hobbes and Hume, all sorts of different perspectives to the nature of law, how amenable it is to change, natural law, conventional law, etc. But there is, and this is the crucial point, a special halachic dimension to this discussion. Legally, if the halakha is divine and immutable, then its significance is far greater than any other legal system assigns to itself. Now, there are rabbinic licenses, mostly temporary or added on, layered on in addition to divine law. That is all true. Some of that is curtailed in our time. We don't have the Sanhedrin. But there are systems that allow for dealing with new circumstance. Far more important is the rabbinic capacity to reassess, to analyze, to examine the circumstances, the opportunities, as well as the challenges, and to determine whether indeed within the system there isn't a possibility of a different approach, a way of deepening the old approach, etc. In other words, in confronting the challenge of innovation versus tradition, the first step is always to analyze the issue of legality. And if legality is not something that can be justified based on the system itself and its normal processes and methodology, which includes examining how things were done in the past, not simply as an insignificant historical record, a meaningless historical record, or an act of nostalgia, but as a mechanism, what my great professor of Jewish history sometimes calls as an invisible text, Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, I should give credit, an invisible text. How Jewish communities, how Chachmei Masorah dealt with parallel situations, what is our tradition, is significant not because you can't change the past per se, but because in many cases, and it requires discernment to figure this out. The past, the Masoret, the tradition, reflects an orientation, an ethos of Weltanschauung, a Jewish philosophy. So the first step is legality. That requires keen halachic thinking, responsible halachic thinking, competence, and so on. But there is an equal, more amorphous, in some cases, more significant step. It was alluded to in both earlier presentations, and we'll call it desirability. The question of whether or not, even if you could legally justify a certain new practice, a different approach, as opposed to what had previously prevailed, whether that would be halakhically desirable. But I don't mean here the slippery slope. It's also an important factor, but it's not what I'm speaking about. Something much more core and basic. And that is, the halakha, as a system of norms, is also, much more importantly, a system of values. It's a philosophy of life. Torah is a telos, it's our purpose, and divine direction is what gives consequence to our lives. Then it's important to understand that embedded in the norms, in the do's and don'ts, if you will, is a value system. Rabbi Sperber made reference to the famous commentary of the Ramban on Kedoshim to you. Torah says to be holy. Ramban develops the notion of al tihi naval b'shus HaTorah, not to take license. But I think that what he meant was not merely not to abuse the law, but to find the philosophy of law, the values in halakha, and to be consistent with that aspect of law as well. Even if something is technically permissible, we have to assess its internal value, meaning, before we determine whether it's desirable to tamper with past behavior. After all, the Torah is prehistorical. Chazal tell us, histakel ba'oraisa ubara alma. Literally, the Ribono Shel Olam looked into the Torah as a blueprint of creation, which is a fascinating idea and somewhat mystical, but I understand it in a very rational way. Meaning, the purpose of the world was to construct a society which the norms of the Torah reflects. The Torah is post-historical. We accept the ruling, does Maimonides, of Shmuel, who said that Ein bein olam hazeh liyos HaMashiach ela shibud malchios bilbad, that even in the Messianic era, there'll be time of tranquility, a time of self-reflection, and a time to intensify our immersion in the Torah that was given to us so many years ago. The Torah will not change, even in the time of the Messiah, according to Rambam's ruling. And therefore, the values of the Torah and the norms are ahistorical. Now that, of course, does not preclude this worldly engagement. The other unique feature of the Torah is its dynamism, its intention to be given to imperfect humans, and the desire that it actually be implemented across different eras and different societies. Mori Rabbi, my great teacher, Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, used to say that if you had to coin a 14th Ani Mamin, we know of the 13th, but if he could, he said, add a 14th, it would be the conviction and the faith that in every era, no matter what the cultural or other challenges are, the Torah remains consequential and relevant, and the foundation of our lives. Immutable and yet dynamic. Maran Shabbat and Daf Pechet explains the Torah was given to human beings with all of their flaws and all of their foibles, precisely because it was meant that they should be junior partners in the process with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the rich history of the development of halacha and how certain concepts evolve reflects exactly this willingness to engage, but also responsible engagement, an engagement which is not infinitely flexible, but one which operates according to a known and very distinctive methodology, and both legal and of values. To retain the divine imprimatur, to retain its integrity, this constructive interaction has to be monitored by, especially, the prominent Talmidei Chachamim of every generation. The Torah is intended, the halakha is intended for real-world situation. Torah Hashem indeed is so tamima, it's so self-sufficient, that we even reject divine intervention in halachic matters. The Talmud tells shocking stories of divine intervention being rejected. God has no place in halachic discussions once the Torah was given with a proper self-sufficient methodology to man. But all of this bespeaks not only of man's capacity to input the system, but especially the assumption upon which that is based, namely the integrity, the rigor, the Masorah-oriented halachic methodology that it's based on. Struggle, debate, challenges of contemporary values or trends in every society certainly adds immeasurably to the substance and the function of this pursuit. But it's important to understand that there are cultural trends that are capable of tweaking and upgrading the system, and there are many which have to be rejected when perceived as red lines, inconsistent with either legality or with the question of desirability. The question of legality begins with the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. In some cases, it's self-evident that we're dealing with a red line, with something that does not have a proper halachic solution. And as Ovdei Hashem, as committed Jews, it's in that situation that we embrace the ancient system, even when it is at odds with cultural values. If we didn't, it would undercut the divinity of the system and its role as the foundation of a meaningful life. Contrary halachic factors or opportunities, ambiguities of application, all of these are factors in assessing halachic legality. There's a rich history of such analysis, engagement, ample precedent. It does not reduce to a simple mathematical formula, but there are clear guidelines and parameters. The Talmud has numerous debates. It's all about debates and controversy. It has methods of resolution. There are some times when it's appropriate to say Elu ve'elu diber elokim chayim, that there's more than one acceptable view, even though we strive somewhat for uniformity, at least at a time when we have the mechanisms to create that, mishpat echad yeh lachem. At the same time, there are views, even views that were propounded by great scholars, that are simply out of the pale. They don't qualify as Elu ve'elu. One can't say, Kimli kedas yachid, I rely on a particular view in all situations. There are rules of engagement, very reasonable rules. There's something called a ta'ut b'dvar mishnah, something else called a ta'ut b'shikol hadat. There are numerous Talmudic sources that discuss a whole range of methods of discernment and so on. But the question of hashkafa, the desirability of a particular value, the Masorah of values, if you will, is something that is even more amorphous and which requires an even greater reliance on the master diagnosticians of the system, who are immersed in it, who intuit in some cases, although based on logical and halachic arguments that form the foundation, what is and what is not a desirable pursuit in the world of halacha. While there is no infallibility, no human being has that status, the decisions that are made are neither arbitrary nor infinitely flexible either. And on the contrary, the more we rely on people of integrity and stature to make those decisions, ironically, something not quite well understood, the greater flexibility the system has to respond to positive innovation and developments. It could be demonstrated that these twin criteria, legality and desirability, are at the core of the halachic enterprise and perspective in all matters of innovation, deviation, adaptation, tweaking, and so on. Confronting these issues, the goal then is not merely to establish technical legal compliance, that something is not explicitly out of bounds legally. If indeed our motivation is merely to conform with or to reform based on or inspired by values that come from other cultures and systems, rather, we need to embrace the halachic system as an internal way in its totality, as a surrender to divine will, enthusiastically as a gift, v'chayei olam latad b'samchenu, literally the gift of life planted within us that ennobles and purposes our lives. The first thing we hear about from Avram Avinu is not his quest for monotheism. That is strikingly absent from the Torah. All of that theological foundation, absolutely not in the narrative of the Torah itself. The first thing we're told about him is that he responded to the triple challenge of Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'moladetecha u'beis avicha. A triple concentric cultural challenge. He was being charged to chart a way, a different way, one which would interact with other societies, and based on his deep understanding and discernment and the guidance of the Ribono Shel Olam, decide what cultural aspects could be integrated successfully, but at the same time, Lech Lecha, to chart an independent course on all three levels. Me'artzecha, me'moladetecha, me'beis avicha. We won't pursue the details. Nasa v'nishma demands of us that first we accept the norms of the halacha, and then we analyze what the value implications of those norms are, so that we can widen our appreciation of the opportunities and possibilities of life. Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch used to say, on the famous comment, Kavata itim la Torah, we're told in the Gemara in Shabbat that in the world to come, each of us will be asked important questions. We're going to be asked questions soon. But, what's that?
Each of us men.
Each of us men? Not sure. Each of us people will be asked, I think, Kavata itim. I too agree that half of the population is female. Kavata itim la Torah is one of the main questions that will be posed to each individual. Rav Hirsch, in a homiletical fashion, but in a very powerful comment, suggested that we interpret the word, what it really means is have you set aside time for the study of Torah. Nothing is more important than that. But the way he interpreted it was, Kavata itin la Torah. Did you set the times to the Torah, or did you set the Torah to the times? Meaning, were you careful about where you were drawing your cultural, your values from? And in light of that, tweaking and upgrading your system? Or did you overstep in some cases and take things, integrate things in which really are antithetical or incompatible with those values? That's the challenge of innovation and tradition. It's a challenge that applies to each and every generation. The flux that is in the nature of life and the obligation of Jewish law to remain dynamic, to be part of society, to contribute to society, always ensures that we will confront these issues. Some historical perspective is important as well. Every generation confronts challenges. Every generation invariably panics and assumes that it is the first or maybe the last generation that can preserve the system. In fact, any student of history can tell you, and it's necessarily so, because as I said, it's intrinsic to the nature of Jewish law and the dual obligation of being faithful to it and also living in the world, that although the challenges of every generation are different, opportunities and challenges, the phenomenon of relating to these questions based on these twin principles of legality and desirability is a recurrent theme. Let me say something very quickly about the gender issues. Here too, one needs to apply, in my opinion, based on legality and desirability, two criteria. And doing so will help us to move forward, to avoid pitfalls, and really to advance the cause of Judaism for all Jews, men and women. Halacha has extensive views about gender roles. They don't devolve exclusively or even primarily on the hot-button issues of clergy or rituals and so on. They are strewn throughout the totality of Jewish law. They speak of yichus, right, heritage and legacy and inheritance and serving in the Beit HaMikdash. There is a perspective that emerges from the cumulative evidence of the total system that needs to be consulted on these issues. When we live in a time of almost unprecedented egalitarianism, a time in which the egalitarianism that is being promoted more and more, even in the last 10 years, is one which is, I think, unfettered, uncritical, it's particularly important for us to go back to those sources, both from the perspective of legality and of desirability. Mori Rabbi, Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, and Rav Hirsch 100 years earlier, I could invoke the name of many other authorities as well, but they were very sophisticated and articulate expositors of the total system. So certainly fine to cite their formulations. I think it reflects the totality of the halachic system. Suggested that there were two components to the halachic perspective or philosophy on gender roles. The first is equal Kedushas Yisrael. That men and women are Jews. Jews are also people, but we'll stick to the Jewish part today. As Jews, men and women have equal sanctity in the presence of the Ribono Shel Olam. Their axiological value is the same. The fact is that 90%, don't hold me to the math, could be more, could be less. Most of Jewish law overlaps. Almost all lavin, even many of the mitzvahs haseh, are common. There's plenty for both men, women, either and both, to be doing before we get into distinctions. Kedushas Yisrael, actually, sanctity, the establishment of Jewish identity, in other words, is actually defined maternally, not paternally. And there are numerous other expressions of this axiological equality, which Rav Hirsch, the Rav, which I think Jewish law champions without any qualification. At the same time, it is also equally evident that Judaism does not believe that all difference is unequal. I'm here in the United Kingdom, so when we say that in America, it invokes a Brown versus Board of Education. I don't know if you have the same cultural significance here. But the halacha's view is that spirituality can be equal, and there can also be differentiated, specialized roles, and even ontologically different, to use Rav Soloveitchik's term, religious personas or personalities. This is reflected in the differences that the halacha projects. Indeed, this kind of spiritual specialization is an axiom of the totality of halacha, quite apart from gender issues. Again, the broader context. Whether it's Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, the different Shvatim, the limitation of the Malchus to Shevet Yehuda, and numerous other issues. It's because women and men each form 50% of the population that we focus inordinately, perhaps, and for pragmatic reasons, on the gender issues. But gender needs to be understood against the backdrop of the totality of how we understand spirituality. Judaism always rejected the minimalist argument of Korach, we're going to be reading about him in a couple of weeks, which was masked as a statement of democracy. Ki kol ha'eda kulam kedoshim ubesocham Hashem. Anybody can do anything because of equal axiological spiritual value. Judaism doesn't believe that. They believe that everybody has equal spiritual value, and there is specialization of roles. Somehow, the divine source or authority decreed that is a more spiritually ambitious or effective or efficient, I'm not sure which or all three, method of religious behavior. These are reflected in the total assessment of halachic differences. The capacity to generate a minyan, a tzibor, is a male prerogative. Yichus, who is a Kohen, who is a Levy, who is Yisrael. Avodat kahuna. Other more public and formal roles are generally the prerogative of men, including the kingship. The role of a dayan was mentioned by Rabbi Henkin before, etc. The more inward, the more empathetic, centric roles are obviously focused on the female gender, but of course, any individual is able to partake of all of these. The role of the avot and imahot in the biblical narrative is of equal value. I would argue that Sarah and Rivka and Rachel and the other great figures of the Tanakh are of equal importance, but their roles were different. The narrative clearly establishes that is the case. Moshe Rabbeinu said Shira and led the men, and Miriam led the women, and that was perfectly acceptable. It's important for us to analyze this cumulative perspective and to see it as the background, even as we move towards trying to establish policy for a lot of contemporary issues. Let me just conclude by saying that Masoret, tradition, plays a great and important role in this dynamic as well. Professor Sperber mostly dismissed it as a nostalgic record of the past. I think he quoted Rav Kook, who said that it's permissible, if something is permissible, then it can be implemented, even if it wasn't done in the past. I think that all halachic authorities would agree with that statement, and with the statement that while we reflect, even revere in some cases, past history of Jewish conduct, that per se is not an impediment, especially when there is positive counterpressure to viewing or implementing a different policy. However, to me, Masoret is much more than a record of the past, even a nostalgic record of the past. To me, it includes, in a very fundamental way, the ethos, the Weltanschauung, the philosophy, the values that I was speaking about before. What's necessary always to investigate whether past conduct is merely a historical record, or whether it doesn't demonstrate a perspective, an orientation, which should continue to guide us today. Indeed, our goal in the end is l'hagdil Torah u'l'hadira, to deepen and intensify our relationship with Jewish law, with the Ribbon Shalom through Jewish law, and this is something which requires that we be careful legally, that we be ambitious in terms of desirability, but that we pursue these matters, on the one hand, in an open-minded way, and at the same time, with a great measure of humility and of integrity. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to divide a few questions into three separate sections. One is education, the other one is leadership, and the third one is ritual. So starting with education, what would the panel like to say as regards what women should be learning and what they should not? Rabbanit, can you start?
I just want one word of response to Rabbi Rosensweig's erudite words, which is I've been fascinated to see how many daughters of Gedolim are either lawyers or math professors, apropos of gender roles. We in Israel have seen quite a bit of it. If you look into the prestigious families, you see not a few women who are today judges within the secular court system or lawyers. And Rabbi Rosensweig, and he will understand what I'm saying, Rabbi Rosensweig invoked Shmuel, I will also, Hakol L'Shem Shamayim. I think Torah needs to be learned, and it's not the question of what should be women learn, and what should women learn, but how should Torah be learned. If you're learning, you need to learn Torah properly, and that means that a young child, a high school student, someone who's beyond high school should not be learning the same diet, the same curriculum. I do not see any reason why in this day and age women should not be studying Talmud or girls should not be studying Talmud. I think it doesn't need to be the central core of the menu, but it engages the mind, and today the heart is engaged where the mind is engaged. I would add to that in our communities, women are going to go on to university today. Some of them will be getting advanced degrees today, and it makes no sense to be studying other other disciplines, other philosophies, more than we're studying our own Torah. So I would start girls on Gemara at the same time you start boys on Gemara. I'm a great believer in the system of self-motivated learning, Beit Midrash-based learning, in which the student is equipped with the tools and has the opportunity to have a non-mediated exposure to the text, after which, of course, there's a personality who gets up and delivers a class. I'm not putting before you a curriculum, but there needs to be a concentration on halachic learning very early on. Halachic learning of girls is generally mitachat l'chol bikoret. It's generally on the level of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It's generally awful. And if you want people to engage with halacha, they need to understand it from the source.
Rabbi Sperber, would you like to...
I find myself in a very funny situation because I sort of agree with everything the other people said. Rabbi Rosensweig, who I thought would probably disagrees with me on every detail of the things that I've tried to encourage, when he described his credo, it's exactly the same as mine. The legality, the desirability, and a term that he didn't use, the meta-halachic basis of Torah morality, which I think is something so very basic that it mandates, it demands of us to answer the desires that you mentioned, Rabbanit Henkin. One of the desires is the desire to learn. One of the desires is that all the books that I learned, my daughters could learn. I have 7 daughters, and only 3 sons. And nowadays everything's open. There's no Torah Nistar anymore. There may be differences in the style of learning. In the Midrashah in Ilan, which I ran together with the Beit Midrash, we have 750 women that learn half-day Torah. I find that in many ways they're much more sensitive. They ask interesting questions that their male counterparts don't. Maybe because they started learning later, maybe because they have a slightly different mental and emotional, psychological makeup. I don't know. But I find that there is an additional dimension in their understanding of the same texts that we learned. I agree 100% with Rabbanit Henkin. They have to learn. And they have to learn thoroughly, and they have to have good teachers. And we're developing a generation. Bear in mind that not so long ago you didn't have that many female teachers to teach women. And now we have a new generation of them who can empathize with their students in a much more effective fashion. And there are certain questions, not only halachic questions, that women will not easily ask a man, but they will ask a fellow woman. And that's also a part of learning. And the levels of learning, and depths of learning. And there are different schools of learning. Hasidic Batei Midrash are quite different from Lithuanian ones. So we have a number of different styles of learning. Maybe there are new askolot shel limud that are being developed in the new institutions of where women learn, whether it's Nishmat or whether it's the Midrashah or whether it's Drisha here in the United States. Oh no, we're not in the United States. That's tomorrow. So, you're confused when you're moving around from country to country. So, as I say, I don't see that there are sort of limits and limitations to what women can learn, and I think it's every institution has to develop its own curriculum, and it has to be gradiated from the simple to the complex, from the basic to from the general to the particular. But getting back to what I heard from Rabbi Rosensweig, I heard things which I agree with 100%, but which seemed at various stages of the presentation to present sort of contradictions. The Torah is immutable, but it changes all the time. It changes all the time because it has to, because it's dynamic. And that there's a whole system in place. We call it Klalei Psak, which are the tools, the mechanisms which we have been granted to enable us to reformulate halachot in such a way that they, through generation, from generation to generation, they accord with the basic meta-halachic morality of the Torah. You mentioned Terachea Darchei Noam. There are many other of these notions which are the underpinnings, the foundation. Certain things katmu b'Torah. Certain things not only came historically before the Torah, they are the foundations upon which Halacha is based. And there are certain moral and ethical criteria which emerge from the halachic literature. And it's interesting that some of these very basic notions only occur almost by the way. Terachea Darchei Noam occurs, as you said quite correctly, as a way of not permitting a certain plant to be used as one of the aluminium. It occurs in other places too. But it's such a basic notion. K'vod HaTzibur, K'vod HaBriot. K'vod HaBriot maybe only occurs in the Talmud 7 or 8 times. But it's so basic. And we have to build our halachic Weltanschauung taking into account these basic notions. And I think you said that. And that's what I think we are trying to do. That's probably where we disagree.
Rosensweig, please.
First, let me respond a little bit to Rabbi Sperber's last comments, and then I'll try to move backwards to the question of education. I'm sure we do overlap in some of our and agree, and certainly it's presenting some of the major principles of Halacha and Halacha as a philosophy, and so on. And I'm sure that we probably strongly disagree on some of the applications, which we'll get to going forward. But I think that we also have a slightly different perspective on, I guess, the use of certain terminology, which I'd like to clarify. People can hear me? Yeah. Okay. Firstly, I don't think there's anything contradictory about saying that the halacha is immutable, which is not a statement of mine, it's one of the ikarei emunah, and saying that it is also dynamic and flexible. And Rabbi Sperber began to explain it himself. There are principles and there are details, but more than that, there are new situations and there are ambiguities, which any legal system will need to confront. It's not going to remain limited. If it would only be limited to the precedents that are on the books, then it wouldn't have the capacity to govern in an efficient, effective, and certainly not in an inspiring way. So what's immutable are the principles, but what's also mutable are many of the details. What I've tried to present is the notion that these details aren't only norms that are obligatory, but that they also come together in a cumulative way when we analyze them, when an excellent diagnostician of the system analyzes them, is a Weltanschauung. Now the Weltanschauung is not, to me, limited to, and it doesn't always dovetail with what Rabbi Sperber was referring to as meta-halachic, his perspective on what meta-halachic issues are. To me, meta-halacha, it's a term that I actually happen to use quite a bit, is about the philosophy of halacha as I described it, meaning the values that flow from the details. And certainly broader notions like kavanat tzibur and kavanat brios and darchei noam are part of that, but they too are internal values. Mori Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal wrote a very famous article some years ago in which he discussed whether there's an ethic independent of halacha, an article which a lot of people misunderstood, and I remember over the years they always tell me he doesn't understand why so many people misunderstood what he wrote, but essentially what he was trying to write was that a rigorous understanding of the halacha speaks to moral and ethical issues, and therefore ethical issues are not independent of the halacha. Ethical issues are conveyed, and there's a particular halachic perspective on them. This perspective flows from commitment to the details and crossing the dots, connecting the lines, understanding the pattern of more basic thought. Things like Darchei Noam and Kavanat Brios, while important, are mentioned agav, they're inter alia mostly, because they're not separate categories or substructure which trumps or overrides the halacha, such that you would then be able to say, well, the halacha in the books, let's say, what I call the legality, or even the desirability that flows from this cumulative concepts are, definitive in one way. However, there's, a question of empathy and a question of darchei noam, which overrides that. They are important concepts. They have significance in the world of halacha, but again, they have to be assessed, like I said before, internally. They dictate what kind of plant will serve as a hadas and other things. The citation or invoking of darchei noam or kavanat brios, its liberal expansion is in some cases halachically, I think, exaggerated in a way that is counterproductive to discussing some of these issues. What I mean by the meta-halachic system and the compatibility of innovation and dynamism is something which is very much captured by a beautiful story that the Gemara tells, that the Talmud tells in Menachos and Daf Chav Tes, a very celebrated story about Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Akiva. The Talmud tells that, Moshe Rabbeinu was given an opportunity to sit, obviously this is symbolic, but it's important, symbolic, was given the opportunity to attend a lecture of the great sage Rabbi Akiva, who obviously lived many, many centuries after Moshe Rabbeinu was no longer alive. He sat in the back of the classroom and he was mystified. After all, Rabbi Akiva was an extremely creative thinker. He had the ability to, come up with novel ideas. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't understand what he was saying, and he became depressed. After a few moments, the Ribbono Shel Olam turned to him and said, "Stay one more minute." The next time a student asked a question, Moshe Rabbeinu responded. Then to Rabbi Akiva said, "How do you know this particular halacha?" Rabbi Akiva said, "Well, it's halacha the Moshe Sinai. It comes from Moshe Rabbeinu." Then Moshe Rabbeinu understood, because he was able to connect the dots between the Masoret of the past and its application and its evolution with integrity and responsibility going forward. And that is the compatibility of these two concepts. One final word, because I am going over time. I'm a very strong champion of Talmud Torah for any and everyone, including for women. I think that there is great advantage for them being exposed to the process of Torah Shebaal Peh and studying halachic texts. However, I do think that the original prohibition against that, or not prohibition, the advice against it in the Talmud was based on something very important that is still applicable, and that is that to truly appreciate halachic analysis, one has to invest in a language and in a derech HaChashiva, in a method, in a way, a mode of thinking. And without that investment, it's probably much better to stick with the traditional curriculum, and there's much more that needs to be said about this. I do think that ideally, if we can encourage our daughters, all men and women, to invest what is necessary in the study of Torah, that the Torah Lishma, for its own sake, that is something which promotes Avat Hashem, love of God. It's something which familiarizes and therefore sensitizes to the halachic process. And I think that many of our problems would be solved if people had this deeper understanding.
Thank you very much. And now we come to ritual. What part, if any, can a woman play in the synagogue service, whether it be women only or mixed? Who would like to start? Robertson? Or Rabbi Sperber? Okay.
I really don't think I have to speak over here, but none of you know my position. Probably many of you know my position. I've written on it extensively. I've tried to more or less keep to the guidelines that Rabbi Rosensweig has outlined. In other words, to try to examine the sources objectively and try to understand them. I think that there are many, many more opportunities for women to take an active role in certain areas of synagogue ritual than was in the past. In the past, sociologically, women rarely knew how to read. We know that in medieval times they used to go to a separate building which was called Weiberschule. It wasn't even a part of the same building. And the descriptions of how they would pray at that time, the prayers were in Yiddish in Europe. And there was somebody who was called a Versorgener, that is to say the person that led the service, and the person that led the service was usually a woman. In one historic document we know there was a man, but he was blind. And the service went as follows. There was the Versorgener would say something in Yiddish, and she would say, "Do weint man." This is where you cry. Do weint man. In other words, that was the social situation. Incidentally, in certain Eastern communities, in Yemen, for example, women were a part of these services. They used to come into the synagogue, they used to sit, and I don't want to go into this, but they didn't have mechitzot in their little synagogues, in Sana, in Chodeda, etc., etc. So the situation has changed radically. Women now are capable of reading, they're capable of understanding Hebrew in Israel, perhaps also in other countries, and therefore there are certain areas in what we call technically Tfilat Yachid, where you don't need a minyan, and where an individual can pray individually, that a woman can lead it as a sort of a conductor, keeping the rhythm. There are certain, I believe that women also can have aliyot Torah, and that is something that I've written upon extensively based on the text in Masechet Megillah. Again, we're not going to go into all the details of these things. I also think the women can serve as rabbis, whatever you wish to call them, whichever name you want to give them, and in fact on this Sunday in Hashem, just after Shabbat, in New York we'll be ordaining 5 more women, and again, without going into the halachic issue of whether this is considered sarah and against the view of Maimonides, the counter views which say that whenever women, any community that takes upon itself to agree to the ruling of the person, then that ruling is binding and so on and so forth. Obviously, in the case of women, ordination and all the women from the Marat Academy who have learned very intensively over 4 or 5 years, highly motivated, and they are accepted by the community, by their communities. They are not accepted by the OU communities, of course. But that's my position. My position is a very radical position. My position is certainly on the periphery. But it's a position which is becoming more known, and the movement that I spoke of at the very beginning, expanding the role of women in Jewish life in a very wide variety of manners, is something which is increasing and expanding and taking root, and I believe is enhancing the spiritual life of Judaism. And not of women, because it's not a question of women, it's a question of families. Whole families come to partnership minyanim, ask questions from women, go to shiurim given by women, and it's a completely different model of Jewish life, and I think it's something that's, it's true it's innovative, and it's true that it's not accepted by many, and I realize that I'm a maverick, and probably my colleagues will disagree with me certainly on these issues, but I think that we're doing something very good, very positive, and as it expands, and as it becomes more understood, and as the learning aspect is enhanced, the criticisms will be quietened, and perhaps will be ignored, but we won't be, what's the word, despised.
We'd ask the speakers please to be as brief as possible, because once we start seeing people walking out, that is the time to conclude the meeting.
I will try to be as quick as possible, although obviously there's a lot to respond to. Again, my perspective is based on the principles that I began with. The principles of legality and desirability. I'm trying to read and understand as it has been understood in the past, again, not because we can't change the past, but because of the reverence and respect we have for the previous great expositors of the system, what their perspective would be. It seems to me that many of the innovations, at a practical level, especially the ritual ones and the ones about clergy roles and so on, really defy, in my opinion, both the legality and the desirability tests that I spoke of before. Like Rabbi Sperber, there's no time, obviously, to analyze the sources of all of this, but it's important for me to get onto the record that is my view, and let me just expand a little bit. So let me just take one thing at a time. Firstly, I want to endorse something that Rabbi Henkin said before, and I think it's very relevant to this issue. I mean, the question of ritual and the role of women in the synagogue and the need for these kind of innovations, which I consider to be fundamentally, although I think they're different innovations and I have different views on them, but to be fundamentally incompatible with both the letter and the spirit of the law. And this has nothing to do with slippery slopes, by the way. That's, I think, another consideration. It has nothing to do with fragmenting the unity of the community in areas that are very, very visible and very symbolic, which I also think is an important factor, but I'm only speaking tonight to the substance. I would much prefer to see, I do agree that the goal of women feeling more comfortable and not just comfort, but being really part and parcel, finding a place in the Beit HaKnesset, the traditional Beit HaKnesset, with the traditional minyan, the millennial-old practice of tefillah, is a very critical and crucial thing. And I think that we have failed as a community by not doing some very elemental things. Rabbi Henkin mentioned some of them before. I endorse them without qualification. I think mechitzot should be designed in a manner that is halachically rigorous. Again, Rav Soloveitchik wrote very beautifully about the separation of the genders in the synagogue and how that is, again, not discriminatory, but enhancing of the particularly Jewish aspect of prayer. These are articles that he wrote about mechitzah when it was embattled in the 40s and the 50s. Wonderful articles that are every bit as relevant today. But we have failed as a community to provide mechitzot structurally and places in the synagogue. I think programming in the synagogue, for men and for women. And I think it's inexcusable. I agree that more resources financially and intellectually should be put to deepening that experience. And I think it's unconscionable that it hasn't. Even a simple thing like, you come to shul sometimes, there are some women even during the week who want to come to the minyan. I'd be happy to see them there. And, because it's a little crowded, so the men become very proprietary and they basically take over the women's section. Small things like that, I think, are just really unacceptable. And there are numerous ways, I think, programmatically, structurally, just, giving a little thought, even the Mishaberach idea, other things, which can and need to be implemented so that people don't feel correctly, that their experience is a poor one. At the same time, the twin criteria of legality and desirability, in my opinion, preclude the ritual application of new forms of prayer. I think on the substance alone, including the interpretation of the concept of Kavanat Tzipor and Masechet Megillah, again, we're not going to debate it right now, but I don't accept the interpretation that Rabbi Sperber and others who advocate these innovations. I just think it's not a sustainable or compelling understanding of the concept. But I'll say further that in addition to the legality issue, I think that there's a fundamental methodological process issue that, it greatly disturbs me, has been violated here as well. The overturning or reversal of a halachic view, which is unequivocally endorsed by the Talmud, by the Rambam, by the Shulchan Aruch, by every single posek, since that section of the Talmud was written, without greater authority, what we call an Ilan Gadol, is to me something that isn't just a lack of etiquette or cover. I think that the way that the halacha is done as a process, the level of rigor and responsibility is a fundamental question that goes to the question of authority. And I think even more than the practice itself, which I think is not sustainable, and I think that it is very counterproductive, I think the methodological process question here is a very, very serious one. Again, I know that everybody involved is sincere. I have no doubt that the motivation is to provide greater spiritual opportunity. but I think that this is really a very critical issue. If one can, reverse something was explicit in the Talmud, in the Rambam, in the Shulchan Aruch, in which there is no first-tier prominent posek who signs on, then basically we've given away a lot. But it's not just the safety net that I'm talking about, it's the question of methodology and how the world of Halacha is really pursued. I think that is true to some extent also in the clergy issue. Rabbi Sperber made really a one-word reference to the Orthodox Union. I was involved in the drafting of a statement which opposed women's ordination. Again, I do not at all oppose, in fact I endorse women's education, as I say, including rabbinic texts. I don't think that we should be motivated to train postdot. I think what psak is something that is very subtle and needs further elaboration. Rabbi Henkin did speak about it. There's a difference between what we call bar makom, which I think is what she was mostly describing, meaning people who are knowledgeable and can therefore render proper, or can tell you what the halacha is, as opposed to more, I think she characterized it as medama milsa milsa, where greater wisdom and experience and intuition. I think that is the prerogative of a very different kind of training, and that's not something which I think should be the goal of our rabbinic text education either. I think it's understanding the process, understanding the concept. For most men, I think that is the case in addition. I think the question of leadership roles or clergy roles is very much related to that. There are legal questions, which I think are very significant, including srara, the status of smicha. Again, we won't go into the details. I don't think that kiblu alai, which is simply the acceptance of a community, I don't think that overturns technically certain issues, although it does work in judgment and in testimony, but in an ad hoc kind of a way. But I think that the bigger question here is what I was talking about, the halachic ethos or Weltanschauung, the value system of the halacha, which really sees that kind of rabbinic communal leadership as really a male prerogative. It's not good or bad, it's simply what the cumulative evidence, I believe, compellingly dictates. And as such, I would prefer to concentrate on enhancing Torah study, enhancing a myriad of different ways in which both men and women can intensify their involvement in the synagogue, including in tefillah, but proper tefillah b'tzibur, traditional tefillah b'tzibur, rather than looking for innovations which are extremely controversial, divisive, and in many cases, the large, certainly consensus of Torah scholarship is that they are problematic. I think when we do pursue those other goals with all sincerity, I think we also jeopardize some of the gains that have been made in the areas which are, I think, more important. And I think Rabbi Henkin was alluding to this as well. She talked about trying to avoid controversy and selecting the RIETS title in a way that would be more acceptable. I think when we overstep, we run the risk of marginalizing the entire enterprise of intensifying women's avodas Hashem. And as somebody who thinks that intensification is very important, I would be very concerned about that.
Rabbi Rosensweig, when I came up with the RIETS title, it wasn't because I was seeking a title which would be more acceptable. It was because I was seeking humility at the time we were approaching Halacha. It wasn't tactical, it was mahuti. There's a great deal.
It was tactical,
Okay.
it was complementary.
There's a great deal that has been said, which is very wise. I'm going to react to a few things with which I disagree. Rabbi Rosensweig spoke about there being ontologically different religious personas of men and women as reflected in the totality of the mitzvot. And Rabbi Rosensweig said there's plenty for men and women to be doing in the mitzvot. It's actually true. Most of the mitzvot are incumbent upon both men and women. There are 14 positive mitzvot which women are not obliged to perform. It sounds like very few. 14 out of 613, that's almost nothing. The only thing is that all of those mitzvot are precisely those mitzvot which give color, which are the stuff of Jewish life. Tell me what Rosh Hashanah is without blowing shofar. Tell me what Sukkah is without sitting in a sukkah or without taking the Arba Minim. Tell me what engagement with God is without studying of Torah. And that's why it's not a new thing. You go back to the 12th century where women wanted to recite the bracha Asher Kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, who has commanded us to perform the mitzvot, on mitzvot which they weren't commanded. And Rabbeinu Tam ruled then that which the Ashkenazim accepted universally and part of the Sephardim accepted that a woman may do so. What was going on was a reach for enhanced meaning in their religious lives. And a lot of what's going on in the synagogue today is a reach for enhanced meaning in religious life. So I take that very, very seriously. I've been an admirer of Rabbi Sperber for decades. I read his books. Rabbi Sperber has done a great deal. Here's where I disagree. I'm concerned with about partnership minyanim. History will tell whether it catches on or doesn't catch on. I can't predict that. I think the totality is more problematic than any individual component. What I'm concerned about is the attempt to equalize the playing field. I look for enhancement in the meaning of women's lives and men's religious lives. I don't try to say this one is more spiritual than that one, this one is this one is better than this one. That doesn't speak to me. Rabbi Hirsch was cited earlier. He cites the exemption. He speaks about the exemption of women from those 14 positive commandments because they're more spiritual. They don't need those commandments. That doesn't speak to my sensibilities. On the other hand, I'm aware that the playing field is not equal within Halacha. As distinct from Rabbi Rosensweig, who speaks about the divinity, I'm sitting here and I'm reflecting upon the fact that there's the Rambam and the RIETS. As far as the RIETS was concerned, Torah Sheba'al Peh was given word to word by God at Sinai, to the smallest detail of Halacha, but it was forgotten, and therefore the endeavor of the Talmud is to reclaim, to rediscover those laws which were forgotten. The Rambam doesn't hold that way. The Rambam believes that the principles for exposition are immutable, but the derivation was done by the sages. And we all know that there are laws about when a later Beit Din can reverse the ruling of an earlier Beit Din. There are things that we cannot do today in the absence of a Sanhedrin, but in principle, they can be done. And when I pray, Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash, I'm praying for Lishkat HaGazit, the room in which the Sanhedrin sits, when once again there'll be discussion of those laws. Meanwhile, we operate within the framework of Halacha with absolute fealty to Halacha. And what worries me, even though there are expositions in the Talmud that I question whether today, with contemporary sensibilities, we would see in the same way, whether we would say v'limadatem otam et b'neichem, and whether we would say b'neichem v'lo b'notechem, whether a contemporary mind would exclude women. I don't know, but I do know that that's the framework of the the law within which we work, and then we ask ourselves, how do we find ways within Halacha? And what is so exciting about bringing women into the Halachic discourse is that ways are being found, not just by women, by great poskim, to be inclusive of women. But the playing field as we have it within Halacha is not equal. And what I worry about when it comes to partnership minyanim is what happens when those minyanim get to an obstacle that they can't cross, a wall that they can't cross. And I worry about that a great deal. And for that reason, I would like to see innovation in the synagogue in a different way. I would like to see innovation in those areas which are not halachically problematic, but are not done. And people have said to me many times, you're so revolutionary. How come you don't look like a revolutionary? The answer is because a lot of these things are permissible. It's just no one ever did it. I would like to see within the synagogue women giving divrei Torah. I think the key to it all is within Torah study. And I think anyway, synagogue services are much more meaningful if an element of Torah study is integrated into the synagogue service. So many times, either because of a lack of understanding of the Hebrew language, or simply people are being exposed to a Torah reading, and they haven't thought about the questions. Having a woman stand up in the women's section, it can be done during, it can be done after services. But let there be divrei Torah given by women. There are positions that women can take, which the fact that they have not been done does not mean that a consensus can't be built around women doing it. And I think that's the place, rather than partnership minyanim, that I'd like to see. Rabbi Levy asked the question as well about women-only services. Now, that's something which is very, very tricky. It's very tricky because family likes to pray together. However, I just wish to say that my own experience in women only, I'm blessed. I'm the head of a women's school. And therefore, we daven together. And one of the amazing parts of our year is when we say slichot together. Initially, one of the members of our faculty came to me and said, let's have women's slichot. I said, you can't have women's slichot. Slichot is about the 13 qualities of God that we recite over and over in slichot, and you can't say that unless you have a minyan. And she said to me, so we won't say that, but let's have women's slichot. And we found our student body is made up both of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. We created an integrated text with integrated melodies. It is amazing. What about the Yud Gimel Midot? It took me a couple of years to find the formula. The formula is we meditate. When we get to the 13 Midot, we meditate on them. In other words, there's silence. People said to me, okay, you'll meditate for 15 seconds. How are you going to meditate for 3 minutes the way you want to meditate for 3 minutes? So we have a compromise. We meditate for 1.5 minutes. But we meditate. It's something new. It's totally new. It's women. It conforms with Halacha. I would not suggest doing it all the time because there is tremendous value to going to the synagogue together, parents and children. But I just want to say that there is something to women coming to pray together, and it can be done in a way which is consistent with Halacha. Rabbi Sperber and Rosensweig brought up the clergy issue, so I have to respond to the clergy issue. I think it's the wrong way to go. I wish, Rabbi Sperber, you were not doing on Sunday what you're going to do on Sunday. And it is not because I do not think the women cannot play the roles. I think the women can play the roles. I think the women can do a tremendous amount to contribute to the synagogue. The women can certainly visit the sick. The women can certainly counsel the dying. Those kinds of roles which are done by a rabbi can certainly be done also by a woman. Women can also teach. And you've heard me say that a woman who knows her stuff can address halachic questions, provided that she understands, just as a man, anyone who addresses halachic questions has to understand their limits. But I wish, Rabbi Sperber, you were not giving a title. Rabbi Lichtenstein here was cited as Rabbi Rosensweig's Rabbi Lichtenstein spoke at one of the graduations of our Yoatzot Halacha, one of the early graduations. And he said at that graduation, you know, Rabbanit Henkin, the title that you have spoken belies the drama of what you are doing. That's a quote from Rabbi Lichtenstein. And I said to him afterwards, Harav, that is exactly my intention. I am much more comfortable with an understated title. Let history take its course. Let time play things out. Why? Because when you go out and you wave flags and you make statements, you cause people to circle the wagons, dig in their heels, and you move things backwards rather than forwards. Do things in a gentle fashion. Do those things. Do. Women should be in growing roles and enhanced roles. Women should be teaching. Women should be out there teaching, helping formulate a sense of what Judaism is about today. But don't give it a title which is going to be divisive, which is, let performance speak for itself. It takes a certain amount of restraint to do that. But I have to say, and this I say without humility, take a look at the numbers, at who's there. People will say to me, how did you get your Yoatzot Halacha accepted? How come there? I've heard women, a woman who has smicha from an institution in Israel, I don't know whether Rabbi Sperber, you were one of the masmichim, I don't know that, but she said, how come nobody comes to me in my community with questions and they go to you with questions? It speaks for itself. Build a consensus. Take a humble stance. Do those things. Get out there. Do. Let's have women as part of the halachic discourse. Let's have women engaged in halachic writing. That's something that I didn't speak about. It's something critical that we need to be seeing. But let's do it with humility. And let's forego the titles as challenging it is, or let's create titles which are more minor and not create quarrels about the titles. Back to the partnership minyanim, I would like to see the changes that are occurring in ways that will not tear us apart, will enable women to get up, to speak before the synagogue, to feel a sense of dignity in their religious lives, to feel a sense of dynamism, of excitement. That's why I said I want to see a Gubbay in the women's section of the shul. I want to see that excitement, but let's not tear ourselves apart.
Right. For centuries, Orthodox women have been content with male leadership in Judaism. Now this is changing. Women with a high level of Jewish education are looking for a more important communal role to match what they are capable of in their working life. If the status quo continues, do you think this will result in many women leaving Orthodox synagogues and perhaps an Orthodox life? Could we do it all in about a minute or two for each?
I think it is very important to be concerned that women do not check out of orthodoxy as a result of feeling alienated, ignored, or transparent. I think tonight I've offered suggestions of ways in which women will be exercising actual leadership, including halachic leadership.
All of us will certainly agree that we don't want anyone, not men or women, to leave Orthodoxy. That's a concern that all of us, I think, as responsible, any responsible leader needs to come to grips with. But I will repeat something that I mentioned in my introductory remarks, and that is that this is not the first time that we have encountered challenges. That if you look at the literature, it's very fascinating. You could almost close your eyes or just change the names almost every 50 years. we find the same kind of crisis, the same kind of concerns. Those who have been thoughtful, visionary, and at the same time have led with integrity and with principle, have been able to discern what is legal and what is desirable, have been able to be open to changes that are proper and enhancing and in the spirit and according to the law of Halacha, but also equally those who had the conviction to define what those red lines are in order to preserve the tradition, so that as ambassadors of Torah law, that we are not overstepping our bounds, even out of empathy and even out of panic, are generally those who have been amazingly successful in reviving orthodoxy in our time. The epitaphs were written, not so long ago, and it's just remarkable. We're here today, we're having a very lively discussion because people do care. They do have a sense that halachic Judaism is authentic, that it is ancient, and that it has a divine imprimatur, which I'll just mention inter alia. Of course, the details of halacha are argued, and of course, many of them are disputed and evolve. That's not what we mean by divine. What we mean by the divine is the system and the methodology and the process which allows for the kind of analysis that we spoke about, whether it be of the Chachmei Mishnah, Chachmei Gemara, or the Rishonim, or the present poskim. So we should have a great deal of faith. We should be optimistic, I certainly am, and we should be principled at the same time. That's a large order, but one which is required of us. Thank you.
I think we all agreed on one thing, that there should be red lines. It's just that each of us is going to draw the red line in a different position. I just want to mention to Rabbanit Henkin, here in England, the suffragettes chained themselves to the fences outside Parliament. And had they not done that, the status of women the world over nowadays would not be as it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. What I want to do is to thank the panel for having disagreed so nicely.